So this is the fifth and final sort of the talks this week on the Bible and history, particularly the Old Testament and history is what we've been talking about so far. But we're going to just kind of have a quick look at the time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this is sometimes referred to as the 400 years of silence, but we're just going to have a little bit of a look at that time now. So we'll do a little bit of a brief recap and then kind of jump straight in. So this shows a map of the Persian Empire in and around the year 500. But by the time we're looking at it, we're looking around the year maybe 360. The situation isn't quite the same. They don't control this region in the Far East, around the mountains, the Hindu Kush. They are having issues with the rebellion in Egypt, and they don't fully control the cities along here. But even with the fact that they have lost some of the outlying regions of their empire, this is still the largest kingdom on earth at the time, and it has, on paper, it's extremely strong. So in theory, it's the strongest kingdom in the world, but in practice, it's maybe not quite as strong as it looks. The provinces, the outer provinces, are impoverished. The subject peoples have no loyalty, and the outer regions are breaking out in revolt again and again and again, particularly Egypt, but also kind of the Greek city-states along the western coast of Turkey. The Persians are just kind of struggling to kind of control the edges of the empire. So this is a verse from the Book of Daniel, and even though the Book of Daniel is not written during this time period, it does look forward to an event that seems to happen now. Most people are in agreement that this verse is referring to what's about to happen next. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So obviously this is figurative language, but what is it figurative language for? We're fairly sure it's for Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great, he was a king of Macedon. Macedonia is a kingdom in the north of Greece. And his father, Philip, has conquered most of Greece. Greece is normally made up of independent city-states that don't like each other very much. But Philip conquers Greece, and he builds up a very formidable army. And Philip had been planning to invade the Persian Empire, but Philip then died unexpectedly, and his son Alexander took over. And Alexander follows on in his father's footsteps and follows his father's vision. And after sort of solidifying his control of Greece, he launches a lightning campaign against Persia. So he crosses over into Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, and he defeats the local armies and then pushes down towards the region that we would now call Syria, and he beats the armies of the great king of the king of Persia. The king of Persia retreats, and Alexander goes and turns his army southwards to march along the coast, basically down towards the cities of Tyre, down towards Egypt. So there is a tradition that Alexander went to Jerusalem. So the tradition says that Alexander visited Jerusalem and he paid homage to the high priest. This is probably not true, but we do know that a part of Alexander's army does attack the Samaritans when the Samaritans don't surrender quickly enough. So Alexander passes through the region. He destroys the city of Tyre in a very famous siege, which actually had been predicted in, I think, Ezekiel. It had been predicted in an earlier part of the Bible. And he took back Egypt from the Persians. Now, the Persians had spent a lot of time and effort subjugating Egypt just previously, and the Egyptians were so annoyed at the brutality of the Persians in crushing this revolt that as soon as Alexander shows up, the Egyptians immediately surrender, switch sides, and go over to help Alexander. So Alexander is crowned as Pharaoh of Egypt, and yeah, so Egypt, which would have been very difficult to hold otherwise, because of the way the Persians had behaved, immediately sort of switches sides and so on. Alexander takes the opportunity to found a new city at the mouth of the Nile, at a place called Alexandria, which he names after himself. And he then goes and turns his armies around, marches back up along the coast to head inwards towards Mesopotamia. So Alexander meets the Persian king, a person called Darius III, and he fights Darius at a place north of Babylon. And he defeats the Persians there, defeats them quite significantly. And Darius flees inland. So Alexander follows in hot pursuit, and he goes and he attacks the. He doesn't really attack. At this point, the cities are just kind of surrendering to him because Alexander is kind of getting a reputation for invincibility at this point. So he takes the cities of Babylon, of Susa, and of Persepolis. And do you remember I was talking about how the Persians would gather tribute into the inner provinces and never send it out again? Yeah, so when Alexander's armies come to these cities, they're finding literal tons of gold lying around the place. Tons of gold, tons of silver. The wealth of centuries is being just sort of lying around for anyone to take. So in a certain way, you could look at this as the largest theft of money in history. It is how some people kind of look at it. It's a huge amount of loot is taken. So Alexander chases Darius into Iran, and finally Darius's generals get sick of Darius and they kill him. Alexander keeps chasing them anyway, and he follows them into Central Asia, fights in Central Asia, and then his armies move down through what we would now call Afghanistan and into northern India. And in northern India, as you can see in this picture, he fights against one of the local kings, wins a victory there. Now, Alexander wants to keep pushing on. He knows that there's more kingdoms ahead of him. He wants to push on. The Greeks believed that the world was surrounded by a great ocean, and he wanted to reach this ocean. So he wanted to keep pushing on until he reached the edge of the world. His soldiers did not want to do this. His soldiers had had enough. They'd fought for 10 years without rest, and they were sick and tired, and they wanted to go home. And they'd already, like, there was nothing more to fight for. Each of these soldiers had like handfuls of gold, like just wherever they wanted. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. There was nothing more to fight for except Alexander's imagination. Alexander did not take lightly to being ignored, and he sulks for a few days, but his army just isn't going any further. So he turns his army around, and they go back to the center of the empire via a new and unexplored route. So I just thought it would be useful to give an idea of what all Alexander had done in 10 years. So in 10 years, he had managed to conquer all of this. And this is pretty extraordinary. Like, this is a large, like, even today, this would be a very, very large empire. But we look at it now and we kind of go, Russia would be bigger and so on. But that's kind of ignoring the fact that in those days, the population of the world is much more concentrated along this sort of band, if that makes sense. So you have a high population in the river valleys of China, the river valleys of northern India, river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and a little bit out in the Western Mediterranean. And that's basically where most of the people in the world live. So Alexander has actually conquered a fair percentage of the actual people of the world, if that makes sense. So how does he do this? And yeah, basically the army of the Macedonians is quite formidable. So imagine being in front of these guys standing here, and you try and attack this lad here, but you're 30 feet away from them, and there's a bunch of spears. So you've got to try and get past all these different spears and try and attack these fellas, all the while they're marching forward. You can't shoot at them with arrows because they're wearing heavy armor. They're not vulnerable to arrows. And imagine, okay, there's only a few of them that are shown here, but imagine these lines stretching out for maybe half a mile, maybe another half mile this direction. Like, it would be terrifying to be stuck in front of these guys. If they start marching forward, there's not really much you can do. You can try and attack the sides, but Alexander is quite good at protecting the sides of his armies, and he knows that because the sides of his armies are the only weak points, the enemies will have to attack there, and this actually means that they have to open themselves up to him to actually do other stuff. So I don't want to talk too much about the tactics of the military sort of stuff of it, but just to give an idea of how Alexander is able to conquer so much so quickly, part of it is to do with this. So we go on to the death of Alexander. And Alexander returns to Babylon, which is at the center of his empire. And either through illness or through poison or through excessive drinking, Alexander falls deeply ill and he approaches death. Now, Alexander's still quite young. Remember, it took him only maybe 10 years or so. So I think he's maybe 33 at the time he dies. I could be wrong. If it's not 33, it's quite close to it. He has no clear heir. He has a half-brother who has severe mental sort of disabilities. His chief wife is pregnant, possibly with a son, but it's not clear that either certainly neither the unborn child nor the half-brother could inherit the empire without someone else stepping in and acting as regent and ruling on their behalf, at least for some time. So as Alexander is dying, it is said that his generals gather round his deathbed and are urgently asking him, "To whom will you leave your empire?" And it is said that Alexander whispered, "Toi kritistoi," which is that is Greek for "to the strongest," which is a terrifying thing to say to very ambitious generals. It's quite possible that what instead Alexander was actually trying to say was "toi krateroi," which means "to Craterus." Craterus was one of the generals, but Craterus wasn't there at the time, and the other generals heard what they wanted to hear. And thus, Alexander can be said to have killed more in his death than in his life. Which brings us on to the Diatici. Now, the Diatici, this word here, this just means successors in Greek. It means those who came after Alexander. So, yeah, the wars of the Diatici. The Macedonian generals are now in possession of all the looted wealth of the Persians, and they have huge armies left over from Alexander, and they also have the example of Alexander, who is the greatest general of the ancient world. So these generals are all extremely ambitious, and very soon Alexander's half-brother, his wife, his child, his mother, anyone who has the slightest connection to Alexander is soon murdered by the generals. Initially, the generals try and pretend that they're trying to keep care of the empire, but they're not. Very soon, they start to call themselves kings. So they fight 4 wars against each other for the next basically 30 years. Maybe not 30, maybe about 20 years, give or take. It's a very confusing time. Even Alexander's secretary ends up commanding armies, commanding them quite well, actually, because it turns out even just taking notes around Alexander means that you're a good general now. Finally, the war comes down to a great battle that's fought at a place called Ipsus in 301 BC. And here, Antigonus, man of Ptolemies, and his son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, they're defeated. Antigonus, man of Ptolemies, that means Antigonus one-eyed, and Demetrius, the destroyer of cities. They're defeated, and this ends the last serious attempt to reunify Alexander's empire. So you might think that Demetrius, destroyer of cities, is kind of an unusual name, and you'd be right. The Macedonians don't have names the way we do. We have like a first name and a second name. They would only have a first name, and they only had a very limited number of first names. So to go and distinguish among each other, they would refer to themselves by first name and then nickname. So quite often these nicknames, the generals, are actually quite amusing or interesting. Brings us on to Ptolemy Soldier. This means Ptolemy the Savior in Greek. And Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals. He was originally a governor of Egypt, and later on he becomes king. And he realizes very early on that the empire of Alexander is doomed, that it's going to fall apart as soon as Alexander dies, and he sets himself up to go and immediately declare himself a king in Egypt. Do you remember we were talking earlier about how Egypt, if you can mind the borders of it, is extremely strong? Ptolemy realizes this very early on, and he wants Egypt. He doesn't want anywhere else in the empire, just Egypt. So he goes and he's Greek, or he's Macedonian, but he also goes and portrays himself as an Egyptian pharaoh as well. Very interesting character. He oversees the construction of the city of Alexandria, which is still a huge city in Egypt even today. He also builds the Library of Alexandria, which was famous even today, even though it's gone. His son builds the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is one of the wonders of the ancient world. And another of the wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes, was dedicated to something this guy had done. So he's an interesting character. The kingdom that he founds lasts for quite some time, and it's the longest lived of the successor dynasties. But do you remember what I was saying about how they only have a very limited number of personal names? Yeah, unfortunately, every man who rules Egypt as part of Ptolemy's dynasty is also called Ptolemy. So I think there's 15 different Ptolemies who actually all rule Egypt at different times. So if you're reading the histories, it can be quite confusing as to keep an eye on the numbers as to which Ptolemy is which. The other general that it's worth sort of talking about is Seleucus Nicator. And Seleucus Nicator means Seleucus the victor. And he was the governor of Babylon. He was originally an ally of Ptolemy. He was the one who did a lot of the fighting against Antigonus and Demetrius. And he also fought Chandragupta Maurya in India. If anyone is into Indian history, Chandragupta is very important in Indian history. He ultimately makes an alliance with the Indian king and then turns west to go and to continue his wars against the other successors. And the empire that he founds is by far the largest of the successor kingdoms. So it's larger than the kingdom of Ptolemy, and it has a better army, but it's much more unstable because it's much bigger. It has no clear borders. It's a bit of a mess. So this gives us an idea of the world after the wars of the Diatici, after things kind of settle down to stabilize with the successors. So the map is unfortunately in German. It's a good map, but it's just in German. So here you can see this is the Ptolemaic Kingdom. It's a little bit larger than just Egypt. It also includes Cyrene over here and Cilicia and Cyprus. Around the Holy Land, this is the meeting place between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So the map shows that it's kind of held by both, if that makes sense. This large kingdom around here, this is the Seleucids. It has a power center originally around Babylon, then up around northern Syria. And you don't really need to know about them so much, but there are two other kingdoms, the Kingdom of Thrace and the Kingdom of Macedonia. And these are what are known as the successor kingdoms. So moving on, you might have looked at that map and sort of gone, well, that's a little unusual. It looks as if the Greeks are now ruling the whole of the Middle East. You know, I mean, like what's happening here? We're now into a process of what's known as Hellenization. So there are now, with these new Greek rulers, the lands of the East are now wide open to anyone from Greece to basically just travel to. There's wide open lands, untold wealth. Greek settlers just flood eastwards. And Greece itself actually becomes a little bit depopulated at this time because everyone wants to go east. The new successors found cities. So Alexandria has been founded by Alexander himself. The Seleucids found cities like Seleucia and Antioch, which is familiar to people in the New Testament. So yeah, the main sort of result of this sort of migration of Greeks to the East is that Greek culture, art, learning, literature, language, particularly language, are all diffused throughout the region. And this basically influences cultural trends as far east as China. So this pictured here is the Lighthouse of Alexandria. So it's a wonder of the world. It's built in Egypt, but it's built by Greek architects for Greek rulers for a Greek-speaking city. The language is particularly important because it means after a time when the people in the Western Mediterranean start to become interested in Greek culture as well, that the educated people in cities, all the way from Spain to the edge of India, will be all able to speak Greek. And this actually is quite important later on in terms of the New Testament. People like Paul are able to travel around cities and expect that they'll be able to go and communicate with everyone without any difficulties. This is something that would be quite difficult to do even today. English would be the closest sort of comparison to Greek as it was in those days. This cultural shift is known as Hellenization. The Greeks don't call themselves Greeks, they call themselves Hellenes. So the process is called Hellenization, and this time period is sometimes called the Hellenistic period. So this is actually an example of Hellenization that I actually own. This is a coin of Aziz I. He's an Indo-Scythian king, he's not Greek, and he rules around the year 25 BC, around what we would now call Pakistan. And it's a little difficult to make out, but the inscription around this coin is actually in Greek. So, in other words, even 300 years after Alexander, in areas where the Greeks no longer rule, Greek is still important, which gives you an idea of some of the cultural impact of Alexander's conquest and the immediate aftermath. So we've just seen kind of the world shift a little bit. So it's probably a little time to take a bit of questions.
Tell us something about the secretary.
Yeah, he was called Eumenes. Yeah, it's a little difficult to explain. He gets involved against Antigonus, Monophthalmus, and he shows himself as a really good general. He actually kills Craterus, who Craterus was the general who some people think Alexander wanted to take over the empire, and the secretary was a good enough general that he was able to kill this legendary general. He takes control of an elite unit called the Silver Shields, and he has no kingdom, but he's able to, with the Silver Shields, he's able to march around the empire, sort of making alliances with different people. And he ultimately gets locked in a battle with Antigonus Monophthalmus. He defeats Antigonus, but Antigonus' son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, I think it's Demetrius at the time. Anyway, someone in Antigonus's army is able to go and capture the baggage train. And the Silver Shields are elite warriors. They've fought with Alexander since the beginning. So they carry their lives around in this baggage train. So all their wives, children, gold, etc. are in this baggage train. So Antigonus sends a message to this elite force, basically saying, I have all your stuff. I have all your families, everything, switch sides or else. So ultimately, the secretary ends up being betrayed by the elite unit, even though the elite unit actually quite like him. He's handed over to Antigonus, and thus ends the secretary. Okay, so we'll just go on a bit. So while all this is kind of happening in the eastern lands, in the west, there's a small city in central Italy that is becoming gradually important. I'm sure at this point, I think everyone has heard of it. So Rome it's in central Italy. It's a very small city. It's ruled by a political elite that, for simplified sake, we'll call them the Senate. They continually have to fight for survival. Warfare is very prevalent in the ancient world. Warfare is kind of the rule. Peace is kind of the exception. And the Romans get quite good at fighting, and they turn it into a way of life. And they conquer most of the central peninsula of Italy. This is a symbol of Rome. It's the Capitoline wolf, shows Romulus and Remus. This is the founding legend of Rome. Rome gets locked into a series of wars between Rome and Carthage. Carthage is a city in what is nowadays Tunisia, and it was founded by the Phoenicians, the people who had lived along the coastline north of Israel. During the time of Israel, actually, the Phoenicians had sent out colonies, and these people had settled in northern Africa, founded a city called Carthage, and this city had grown wealthy and powerful in the west of the Mediterranean. They get into a conflict with Rome. They fight 3 wars against each other. And even though the Carthaginians are actually they have some very good generals, they're not able to beat the Romans. So this shows Hannibal crossing the Alps. The Romans are sometimes talked about as if they're brilliant fighters. They are good fighters, but the secret of Roman success is not that they're better fighters than anyone else. The secret of Roman success is that they never ever give up. So you can beat the Romans, you can beat them once, you can beat them twice, you can beat them 3 times. They will always come back at you. They will never surrender. They will never give up. They will keep on fighting until they've won and you've lost. So take what life lessons you will from that. So this is the same map showing. This shows the successor kingdoms in the east, but here you can also see Italy, which is now being controlled by Rome, and you can see in this other color in northern Africa and Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, you can see the Carthaginians. So by the time the Romans have finished fighting the Carthaginians, they've taken over all those territories as well as most of Spain. So this kingdom here, Macedonia, has got involved in the wars. They tried to help out Hannibal. They didn't give him enough help to actually let him win. They gave him just enough help that when the Romans won, the Romans were very annoyed at them. So the Romans basically start to attack Macedonia and interfere with Macedonia. The Seleucids are a bit worried about this Roman movement towards Macedonia. And one of their kings, a guy called Antiochus the Great, he's quite a good general. He has fought wars from the edges of India all the way over to Greece, and he's fought the Ptolemies. He's quite good at fighting. He tangles with the Romans. He gets some help from Hannibal at one point. Hannibal is in exile, comes over to him, but the two generals don't really like each other on a personal level, so Antiochus ends up fighting on his own. The Romans fight the Seleucids at a great battle called Magnesia. And the Seleucids actually should have won the battle, but they make a few mistakes and they allow the Romans to win. The Romans are quite scared of the Seleucid army. If the Seleucid army is commanded right, it can beat almost anything. So to go and to cripple the Seleucid kingdom, they demand a huge tribute. Something that it will be so expensive for the Seleucids to pay that it will cripple them for decades. And they then demand that the Seleucids must get rid of their navy and a lot of their army. So that's kind of the context of it. So we're just gonna, you might be kind of wondering, what's happening in the Holy Land around this time? The answer is actually not a whole pile that we can really talk about much, but the Holy Land has become a lot more prosperous now because it's now a pivotal point again between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms, and also the wealth that has been captured by the Greeks and is now spreading again through the Middle East. This has kind of helped all the regions to become a lot more prosperous, including the Holy Land. So brings us on to the next part, which is we'll talk about the Maccabees. So after the death of Antiochus the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes comes to the throne. He's a usurper. He's an able general. He's quite talented, but he's very strange. Like he is thought to be strange even by people at the time. He needs a lot of money to pay the Romans, and he's desperate for funds. But he also wants to restore his empire to what it once was, and he wants to be able to defeat the Romans at some point in the future. So this is someone, the Romans know this, everyone knows this, they know he's not to be trusted. So he goes and he attacks Egypt under the Ptolemies, and he does actually take Egypt, which is an impressive thing. He does quite well in that. But just after he's conquered Egypt, as his troops are in Alexandria, a Roman ambassador arrives on a ship and gets off the ship, and they don't come with armies, it's just an ambassador. And the ambassador goes and threatens Antiochus. He basically says, if you don't evacuate Egypt immediately, consider yourself instantly at war with Rome. And you don't have time to make a decision, you have to make a decision right now, whether you're at war with Rome. And Antiochus he's in a bind. He has conquered Egypt, he's won the war, but he's not yet ready to face the Romans. So face down with one unarmed man, the entire conquering army has to basically retreat. So you can just imagine just how angry Antiochus must have been. The answer is he was extremely angry, extremely angry. So while he's retreating from Egypt, short of funds and furious, Antiochus hears that there's fighting in Jerusalem, which he interprets as a revolt. In fact, it's just a squabble between two claimants. Both of them want to be high priest in Jerusalem, but Antiochus thinks that it's a rebellion, and he attacks Jerusalem. He loots the temple for funds. Remember, he's desperate for money. So having looted the temple, this would be enough to go and turn any religious Jew against Antiochus now, because this is sacrilege, what he's done. So he leaves a large garrison in Jerusalem, and perhaps feeling that he's already committed sacrilege, so he might as well kind of keep going with the sacrilege, he decides to convert the temple into a pagan temple, probably dedicated to the god Zeus. So it's really, it's not clear what he's trying to do here. Like, maybe he thinks that turning the Jews away from their religion will make them more likely to be part of his empire. It's not clear. He might just be insane. It's very hard to know. This is a picture of him from a coin that I have, and it shows him sort of dressing himself up as the sun god. We suspect that this particular incident is referred to in the Bible in the prophecies of the Book of Daniel, talking about the abomination that causes desolation. Is generally held to at least partly refer to the stuff that Antiochus Epiphanes does in the Temple of Jerusalem. So, yeah, some Jews were actually okay with this, and were actually quite happy to sort of get rid of their religion. But there were those who resisted. So pagan priests were sent out throughout Judea to force the locals to sacrifice to pagan gods. And a Jewish priest in a small town called Modine basically refused. And when the pagan priest tried to force him, Mattathias, the Jewish priest, basically killed him and launched a revolt. The son of Mattathias, or one of the sons of Mattathias, was called Judas Macabeus, meaning Judas the Hammerer, and he led the rebellion. And the rebellion was actually very successful. The Seleucids were locked in a whole series of different civil wars. So the Seleucids still have a strong army, but it's no point having a strong army if you have to fight 20 different wars at the same time. Also, one of the things that was helping the Maccabees was that quite from a distance, the Romans were trying to help them and trying to make sure the Seleucid state was kept as weak as possible. Remember that the Romans feared the Seleucids, so what they were trying to do was to destabilize the Seleucid Empire to the point where it would kind of collapse from its side. So this actually pretty much happens. The revolt of the Jews is very successful. So here in this very light pink, you can see the initial territory of the revolt, and then every ruler of the Jews afterwards expands the territory a little bit. So the different colors show the territory expansions. By the end of the expansion, they've actually reconquered a lot of the core territory that would have actually been held by the old Israelite kingdom. So the revolt is referred to as the revolt of the Maccabees, but the dynasty is referred to as the Hasmonean dynasty. So it's basically the same people. So just to be aware that there's two kind of different names for it. So the people, the religious Jews are delighted about this. The hated Seleucids have been pushed out. The sacrilege is no more. The temple is rededicated. There's all sorts of good things happening. But the non-Jews of the region are not thrilled about these guys because the Hasmoneans are not kind to the non-Jews. They're particularly brutal against the Samaritans, and they actually burned down the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. After a time, even the religious Jews start to become quite annoyed with the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans start to actually adopt Greek culture and sort of follow a lot of the things that they were originally rebelling against. They're also quite cruel, and they don't take any criticism lightly. And they also take on to become kings. They crown themselves as kings. Now remember, I was saying that these were priests, so they're from the tribe of Levi. In other words, they're not descended from David, which means that they have no right to the throne of Israel. So when they crown themselves as kings, they're actually, a lot of the religious Jews would have been pretty annoyed at them for this. They also go and crown themselves as high priests, which again, they're not in line for. They are priests, they are not from the high priestly line. So they have basically usurped the rights that were not given to them, if that makes sense. They were still better than the Seleucids. The pious Jews would definitely have preferred them to the Seleucids, but they were still not happy with them. So let's talk a little bit about some of the writings that happen at this time. So there's a group of writings that we refer to as the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha just basically means the Greek texts that were written in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the Jews don't treat these as part of the Old Testament. They don't see them as biblical. And most Christian denominations would see them as useful, but not class them in the same status as biblical literature. They're nice stories. They're not considered to be divinely inspired. And one of these stories is the Book of Tobit. And it's the story of a Jewish family. It's set at the time of the Assyrian Empire, but the actual writing of it is much later. It's done during the Greek period. Another similar story is the Book of Judith, and this tells the tale of how Israel is saved from a Babylonian invasion by a girl called Judith, who cuts off the head of a Babylonian general, which is shown in the picture. Sorry, a bit of a spoiler alert there, but there you go. It's been out for a while. This is ahistorical. It did not happen. We think it's probably a metaphor for the struggle of the Hasmoneans against the Seleucids, but it really, these books should be interpreted more as metaphor than anything else. They're not really historical. Another book that's written around this time. I'm not going to go through. There are a good few of these books. They can be found easily enough. But one of the books is the Book of Enoch. And this is not in most collections of the Apocrypha, but it is in the Ethiopian Bibles. It's written as if it was written before the flood, but it's written around this time in Greek, so it's not that ancient. Speaking of writing in Greek, the Septuagint is written around this time, and Septuagint is quite interesting because, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think the Bible is written in Hebrew, a little bit in Aramaic, and in Greek. And I don't think anyone on this call actually speaks any of those languages. So when we read the Bible, we read it through translation. And the Septuagint is the first translation that we know of the Bible. So it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the name is derived from, quite confusingly, it's a Latin name for a Greek text. The name is Latin for 70, because there is a tradition that 70 scholars were involved in the translation of it. We're not sure exactly when it was done, but it was in and around this time. And some people think that the translation was done as part of the Library of Alexandria, because it probably was translated in Egypt. But the Egyptian, the Ptolemaic dynasty, really loved their books, and they wanted to have a copy of every book in the world in their library. But so there was a very large Jewish community in Alexandria. It's quite likely that the kings of the Ptolemies wanted the Jewish sacred writings in their library, but it's not proven that there is any connection between the two. Still, it's pretty cool. Also around this time, there is a collection of, it's a little weird to call it writings because at this point it's not writings. There are oral traditions that are built up around what we would call the Old Testament. And these traditions are passed down from teacher to teacher, rabbi to rabbi. And eventually these are written down much later as the Mishnah and the Talmud. And these basically form an important part of modern day Judaism. So just to be aware that that sort of material, which would have been known to the Pharisees, would have been familiar to Jesus, is kind of being sort of begun to be collected around this time. So I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about some of the different religious groupings and the different things that are important to the Jewish religion around this time. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the diaspora. Now, the diaspora is not a religious group, but it's important to remember that Judaism is changing around this time. So around the time of David, most people who followed God were living in close proximity to Judah and Israel, that they would have all been within relatively easy journey of Jerusalem. Now Jews are scattered throughout the known world. So there would be Jews as far west as Spain, as far east as India. Like, considering how difficult travel was in those days, there was no possibility of being able to visit the temple year in and year out. It just wasn't feasible for people. Every Jew would try and visit the temple at least once in their life, and they would try to do so for one of the great festivals, for example, Passover. But they weren't able to go and turn up there all the time. So it's a little, Judaism kind of adapts and changes to this new circumstance, and a new institution becomes important, the synagogue. So it's not a substitute temple. They don't do sacrifices here, but it is a place for the Jewish community to gather, to read the scriptures, and to pray. So it's still, at this point, only a small part of Jewish life, but it really enables the community to maintain some unity. And so even when the Jews are far, far away from their homeland, they still maintain a distinct identity, and a lot of that is down to the synagogue. Also active around this time are the Pharisees. Now, they're not a single school of teachers, but they're a group of teachers who all kind of follow different leaders within them. And they try to interpret the law and kind of protect the people from breaking it. Remember, again, like what I was talking about with the diaspora, the context of Judaism has changed a little bit. So it can be a little bit difficult for the common people to interpret the law. So to try and to help them do this, the Pharisees go and put up like a hedge around the law, is what they call it. So a lot of regulations to stop you getting too near the law, if that makes sense. Now, some of what they actually say is actually pretty respectable, pretty decent. So there's one teacher called Hillel, who is said to have told a Gentile who wanted a quick explanation of the law. Hillel said, "Don't do to your neighbor what you wouldn't want done to yourself," and that's it. The rest is explanation. So when you hear that, that actually sounds very similar to Jesus later on talking about the Golden Rule. So there are similarities between what the Pharisees believe and what Jesus and Paul believes. In fact, Paul was a Pharisee up until his conversion to Christianity. The problem lies not in what they believe, but in the way that they go about enforcing these laws and regulations, and sort of treating the regulations as more important than the law itself. So it's not that their beliefs are wrong, it's the way they go about it. And I'm expressing it a little crudely here, but Colin has talked about this in his sermons in the past. So I think people are probably a little bit aware of the context of this. Also around this time were the Sadducees. Sadducees are sometimes thought of as another school in opposition to the Pharisees, but the Pharisees are actually quite popular. The Sadducees are not. The Sadducees are kind of an elite group of priests who control a lot of the money from the temple. So they're very wealthy, they're very powerful, very influential. They're on the seat of every council, but they're not necessarily very popular, if that makes sense. They only care about the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Anything outside the first 5 books, they don't really have any interest in. And they actually deny the possibility of the resurrection because it isn't explicitly mentioned in the first 5 books, although Jesus actually corrects them on this. So another group that's active around this time are the Essenes. And the Essenes are not as well known to history as some other groups, mainly because they seem to have been a priestly group who were originally involved with the temple, but have a disagreement, and they leave Jerusalem, they denounce the Jerusalem establishment as corrupt, and they go out into the desert, where they form a community that is very focused on purity. So we don't really know much about them apart from that. I mean, we can talk a little bit about them. They're led by a person they call the Teacher of Righteousness, but we don't really know much more than that. We know that they write books. So they copy the manuscripts of the Old Testament, and they write some stuff of their own sort of devotionals and stuff. And do you remember I was saying that papyrus doesn't last long in a wet climate? Well, these guys actually, because they had left civilization, they were out in the desert, and they would go and they would hide their scrolls in jars of clay and then hide those in caves. So these papyrus actually did survive. and they were actually discovered in 1948. And they're some of the earliest and the best manuscripts that we have for the Old Testament as it was written around this time. So we'll take a look back at the affairs in Rome, and I talked about how Rome was a republic. Now we're going to talk about kind of the slow decline of the republic. So the decline of the republic, I think, tends to start around the Gracchi. So Rome is expanding in every direction. They're winning wars right, left, and center. But there are different classes in Rome. So not everyone is winning the wars equally, if that makes sense. So to put it very bluntly, there are rich and there are poor. Every war that they fight, the rich get exponentially richer. Every war that is fought, the poor get poorer. And as a result, there is huge hatred between the rich and the poor in Rome. And one of these rich people, a person called Tiberius Gracchus, puts forward some legislation to try and help the poor people, to try and reform the land, because it's primarily a question of land is what's happening here. I'm simplifying grossly here, by the way. Of course, the real thing is much more complex. This person is called Tiberius Gracchus, and he puts forward a law. His opponents, who don't want to lose their wealth, try and block him politically, but he can't be blocked. So rather than accept the new law, they murder him. And this is the first outright murder in Roman politics, and it sets a very dark sort of precedent. Things go very badly wrong sort of at the beginning from this. His brother, Gaius Gracchus, puts forward a similar law a few years later and is similarly murdered. So about a generation or so later, I talk about the fall of the Republic, but the fall of the Republic happens over generations, so it doesn't fall immediately. It's still very strong. The Romans at this point have become so confident in winning wars that they're not worried about who they fight. They're worried about who will be allowed to fight it so that they can get the money from it. They're really only as soon as they hear that someone has declared war on them, they're already splitting up the loot in their own minds. So Sulla and Marius are fighting over who gets to be general for particularly lucrative war. So I won't go into the sort of details of it, but it ends up that both Sulla and Marius at different times march armies into Rome, not just to go and kill one of their opponents, like had been done with the Gracchi, but to systematically murder as many of their opponents as they can find. So you're looking at the move from sort of a single murderer to like systematic mass executions. But the Republic survives. Marius dies of natural causes. Sulla hands back power after he's killed everyone he can find. And about a generation or so later, moves on to the next phase. And here, these three men decide to split up the Roman world between them. This is Crassus, who's the richest man in Rome. This is Pompey, who's the most successful general in Rome. And this is Julius Caesar, who's probably the most ambitious man in Rome. And these three call themselves, they are referred to in history as the first triumvirate. And triumvirate means something like three-person power in Latin. So they split up the world as they know it between them. Crassus is allowed to kind of keep control in Rome. Pompey is allowed to go east with the huge army to get gold there. And Caesar is allowed to fight a war in what we would now call France. So when Pompey goes eastwards, he crushes the remnants of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids are now no more. The last successor kingdom of the Greeks of Alexander is the only one that's left is the Ptolemies, who are ruled by Ptolemy, and because everyone is so basically the Ptolemies they're still left, but they have to be allied to Rome now, because at this point kind of everyone has to be allied to Rome. The Hasmoneans, the descendants of the Jewish rebels who had fought against the Seleucids, they're fighting amongst each other as to who will be king. And so Pompey is called in to intervene in the civil war, and he does so, and he intervenes, and there's fighting in Jerusalem. There's even fighting in the temple, and this probably would have been okay were it not for the fact that Pompey, who was very curious about what the Jews worshipped, walked inside and took a peek into the Holy of Holies. And this was a huge sacrilege. This was seen by religious Jews as basically being the same type of thing as Antiochus Epiphanes had done. This was a desecration of the temple. So with that one act, Pompey had, probably accidentally, basically poisoned the relationship between the Jews and the Romans. Up until this point, the Jews and the Romans had actually got along quite well. After this point, every religious Jew has to at least have some hatred towards the Romans. So in the confusion of all the different claimants to the throne, Pompey appoints a guy called Herod to become king of Judah. Herod is associated with the old dynasty, but he's not part of the old dynasty, and his family have been noted for their loyalty to Rome, so Herod's a good candidate. He's not liked by the Jews, but he is appointed as king, and he's quite good at staying as king, and he builds a lot of sort of buildings. This is one where he has sort of leveled off a hill in a certain way to make a palace. So we're moving quite quickly, so apologies, we are covering a lot of ground very quickly into the end of the Republic. So remember I was talking about Crassus, the richest man in Rome? He wanted to go and get glory as well. Pompey and Caesar had their fun, he wanted to have his fun. He went and launched a campaign against the Parthians. And normally the Romans were so confident of victory that they would basically always win. This time they miscalculate, and Crassus is killed and his army is defeated. And the standards that the legionaries carry, when the legions go into battle, they carry these eagles in front of them. The Parthians capture the eagles, which is seen as a huge disgrace for Rome. This is a major, major defeat for the Romans. But you'd imagine Rome would then go to war with the Parthians again to try and get the standards back. But without the stabilizing influence of Crassus, Caesar and Pompey now don't trust each other. Caesar has too many legions. Pompey is back in Rome. He wants Caesar to give up his legions. Caesar refuses because he doesn't trust Pompey or the Senate. He demands guarantee of safety. The Senate doesn't give it. And Caesar decides that he's being forced into a war with the Senate. So he crosses the river Rubicon to basically declare war on the Senate. There's a sort of a war between himself and Pompey. Caesar defeats Pompey. Pompey flees to Egypt. Pompey is murdered in Egypt. And then Caesar goes on a lightning campaign all around the Mediterranean and basically reconquers the entire Republic in about a year and a half. So if you've ever heard the phrase, I came, I saw, I conquered, that's actually referring to this time period where Caesar just basically travels around the Mediterranean, winning everywhere he goes. So he returns to Rome, and he's quite sick of the civil wars at this point. He wants the civil wars to be ended. He's a generous man. He pardons all his enemies. So everyone who's fought against him in the war, as long as they have, made their peace with them, he's happy to go and pardon them. No one is executed by Caesar. But he declares himself as dictator for life. This is a Roman position. It doesn't sound as bad to them as it does to us. Dictator is a perfectly okay word for the Romans. But there was the suspicion that he was planning on making himself king. And the Romans do not like kings. They really, really do not like kings. Which brings us on to Ides of March. In 44 BC, Caesar is murdered. Many of the people who actually murder him are people who he had pardoned within the previous year. So in a bit of an irony of history, even though Pompey was defeated, when Caesar was killed, he was killed in the theater of Pompey, underneath the statue of Pompey. So probably the last thing he saw was actually the face of his old rival. If you actually go to Rome, you can see the spot that this happened in at Lago di Torre, Argentina. It's not far from the Pantheon in Rome. And yeah, it's now a cat sanctuary. So you didn't need to know that, but now you do. After Caesar was assassinated, originally the people of Rome were actually quite sympathetic to the assassins, but then at Caesar's funeral, one of Caesar's friends gives a speech and reminds the people of all that Caesar has done for them, and the mob turns against the assassins. They remember what Caesar's done, they are shocked that he's been murdered, and they want vengeance. So the assassins have to flee. Antony has stirred up the crowd against the assassins, against Cassius, against Brutus, but he is not Caesar's heir. Caesar's heir is a young man called Octavian, who is related to Caesar but not his son. And Octavian and Antony try and outmaneuver each other, but eventually end up making a type of alliance. There's another person nearby who has a lot of armies. They ally with him. They bring him into the second triumvirate, the second three-person power. And between them, they split up the Roman world. Octavian takes the west, Antony takes the east, Lepidus is given North Africa. And very quickly, Octavian and Antony outmaneuver Lepidus and remove him from North Africa. The assassins are caught and dealt with and beaten. And yeah, so basically now, with Lepidus out of the way and the assassins out of the way, the Roman world is split between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. And like we had seen with Caesar and Pompey, the world is kind of stable when it's split between three, but it is not stable when it's split between two. So this brings us to Octavian against Antony. So at the Battle of Actium, Octavian takes on Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra is the last descendant of Ptolemy, and she's the ruler of Egypt at the time. So basically, Antony and Cleopatra are defeated, they flee back to Egypt, and they commit suicide, and Octavian is now sole master of the Roman world at the end of the civil wars. So this kind of, it's a little difficult to try and sum up just how important all this is. Octavian is now known to history as Caesar Augustus. And we date the Battle of Actium as kind of the beginning of the Roman Empire. But this, to just call Augustus the first emperor, or talk about this is the beginning of the empire, is to do Augustus an injustice. Augustus is a very subtle politician. When he's finished the wars, he wants to finish the wars for good. He wants there to be no rematch in the autumn. So he doesn't kill anyone when he goes back to Rome. So all his enemies are actually already dead from the civil wars. So he takes care not to kill anyone, to disband his armies, to go and solve the problem of land reform that's caused the whole downfall of the Republic in the first place. And he goes and he makes sure that even though he actually concentrates all the powers in himself, that no one can ever suspect him of becoming king. So he takes no title. He is only a private citizen. He refers to himself as the first citizen of Rome, is how he refers to himself as. So you have this unusual situation where kings of other lands will come and seek audiences with this private citizen who's the most powerful man in the world. And you can get an idea of the subtlety of Octavian, of Augustus, from this statue here. This is called the Prima Porta statue. It's in the Vatican Museum. It's not my picture, unfortunately. But do you remember I was talking about the standards that the Parthians had taken from Crassus? Every Roman general has wanted to go and take those standards back. Pompey, Caesar, Antony, everyone has made plans to attack the Parthians and take them back by force. Augustus is more subtle than that. Augustus simply asks the Parthians, can I have them back? And the Parthians take a look at what Augustus has managed to do, and they're more afraid of this quiet, sort of subtle ruler than they are of the more boastful sort of other generals of Rome. The quiet guy will get stuff done. So the Parthians just give the standards back, and they ask for a peace treaty. Basically, the entire world kind of comes to a peace treaty with, the entire known world comes to a peace treaty with Augustus at this time. He founds a lasting peace. Like up to this point, the civil wars have hit Rome time and time again. The peace that Augustus founds lasts with only a few interruptions for the next couple hundred years. And the reason I'm talking about this is because, I mean, I suppose like even tomorrow, we're going into a month that's actually still named after him. So when we go into the month of August, it's named after this guy. The reason I'm talking about this is because the peace and stability, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that Augustus has given, is one of the reasons that people like Paul are able to travel around the Roman Empire so easily, because the Romans have actually established a lasting peace that isn't just shattered by wars every 2 or 3 years. So He's not the only good politician around this time. The King Herod is also an amazing politician. He's not a nice guy at all, but he's an amazing politician. So this shows one of the fortresses of Herod. This is near the Dead Sea. There you can see the Dead Sea. This is the fortress of Masada. So Herod is a brilliant politician. He has the misfortune of being on the losing side of 2 civil wars, but still comes out smelling of roses. He's not liked by anyone. He's in fact the personal enemy of Cleopatra, but he still manages to survive and to thrive. Augustus confirms him as a client king of Judea, but Augustus doesn't like him, even though he does actually find him very useful. Augustus, in fact, jokes that it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. The pun kind of works better in Greek. It doesn't really work in English. But the joke is effectively that Herod is a Jew, so he doesn't eat pork, so his pig is safe. But Herod is Herod, and he will kill his sons if he thinks that his sons are plotting against him. And Herod does, in fact, kill his children. And so when the Bible talks about Herod killing babies in Bethlehem, this is very much in character of what we know about Herod. Herod would do anything to stay in power. So one of the things that Herod does do is he rebuilds the temple. So the temple had been built by Zerubbabel at the during the Persian period, but it was a small temple. Do you remember I was talking about how people were weeping comparing it to the old temple? Herod rebuilds it again, rebuilds it on vast and lavish scale. Even the great architects of Greece and Rome, who were quite famous for their own buildings, were very impressed with what Herod had managed to do in the Temple of Jerusalem. It would be kind of seen as massive even by modern standards. So this is a scale model of Jerusalem as it would have been at the time of Christ. And so here in the background, you can see the city of Jerusalem as it is. There's a theater. Over here is the fortress of the Antonia. And here in the foreground is the temple. So you can see just from looking at that the temple actually takes up a lot of the space of the entire city, which gives you an idea of the scale of it. But even with sort of bright, shiny new temple and so on and so forth, the Jews are not happy. It's very hard to feel satisfied at this time. Everyone knows that the Romans are the puppet masters behind Herod, and everyone knows that the taxes of Herod are very high. The taxes of the Romans are higher again. Roman punishments are heavy and brutal, and if there's even the threat of rebellion, the Romans will come in and they'll crush it. There's the memory of the sacrilege of Pompey, and the feeling that if the Romans find it convenient, they'll do this again. Basically, the brief period of independence that the Jews had had under the Hasmoneans was looked back fondly on. But the Jews also were kind of going, we don't just want independence, we want a ruler who is actually just and good, not like the cruel and the callous and the corrupt Hasmoneans. And we want independence, but under a just and fair ruler. What they were looking for was a Messiah. And this is the world as it is around the time of Jesus' birth, waiting for a Messiah. So that's pretty much it. I know I've gone over a little bit in terms of the time I usually try and take, but I'd like to say a couple of words just before we sort of finish up. So first of all, we've covered 1,000 years of history in about 4 hours. Because the first talk that we did was kind of like, it was more of an introduction type thing. So at least 1,000 years of history in 4 hours. So if you've made it this far, well done. And I'd like to clarify that I've skipped over a lot of things. Just there's so much to cover in such a short time that there really has been a lot left out. So I've obviously skipped historical details, but even the stuff I have given has mostly been either politics or military. And the reason I'm telling this is because it's the type of history that I actually know I'd be a little more familiar with. But I'd like to just kind of point out that there's a lot of social history that I've omitted. So I haven't really spoken much about what life is like for the average person. And that's a story that's worth telling as well. It's just not one that I've told. The things are worth researching for yourselves. If people want, I can try and send on some stuff to learn more about any of these things that people are interested in. But just so that people, I wouldn't like to give the idea that social history isn't worth studying either. It definitely is. So it's just I haven't time just at the moment. I figured trying to cover that would just be too much for everyone. And just to sort of say as well, I've tried to be as accurate as I can, but when you're covering kind of so much material, the possibility of maybe giving the wrong impression here or there, or possibly even the wrong information, it is possible. So also, there are certain cases where there are multiple interpretations. I've given one interpretation, but that's not to say that there aren't other interpretations in certain cases. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't like to pretend that what I've said here is gospel, if that makes sense. I know just enough of history to know how much there is that I don't know. So I hope that this has been useful, and very happy to help anyone with questions either now or later on, or to help anyone doing any further research. So with that, are there any questions?
Can you give a very quick potted history of things to the fall of Jerusalem?
That's probably, I'd kind of see that more, that's probably, that might be a little too much to go and cover in 2-3 minutes. There's about maybe 70 years or so of history there. It would be a little difficult to give the full thing there.
Okay.
Although it would be worth talking about, just not in 2-3 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you for clearing up the time of the Maccabees for me.
Yeah. I didn't go into huge detail. I mean, there is a lot of information about the actual individual Maccabean rulers or Hasmonean rulers, but I mean, just there's only really time to do a very brief overview of them. But I mean, yeah, there's definitely like for further detail, the works of Josephus are probably worth looking into. He has a book called Antiquities of the Jews, which is written around about maybe AD 80. And yeah, so that's kind of the main source that we have for the Hasmoneans.
There were two things that you mentioned. One was crossing the Rubicon, now taken to be, you know, once you cross it, there's no turning back. And the other was fighting the Parthians and the famous Parthian Shot. Was that Parthian Shot, did that happen in that battle?
Yeah. Parthian Shot just refers to the fact that the Parthians were famous for horse archery, and they were able to attack you, so they could fire when they were leaning forward in their saddle or when they were turning backwards. So it didn't matter if they were attacking or retreating, they could still shoot you. So even when they were running away, they could still kill you. So what happens is, in that particular battle, they lure the Romans out into the desert and then basically go and start charging around them on their horses. The Romans are tired, they're thirsty, they're hungry, and the Parthian cavalry just kind of, even though the Parthians are actually outnumbered by the Romans, their cavalry is so good they're able to basically break the Romans up and destroy them with their arrows and with their heavy cavalry.
Crossing the Rubicon?
Crossing the Rubicon. Rubicon is a small river in the north of Italy, I believe. It's the boundary between the edges of Caesar's province and the territory that was controlled by the Senate. So basically, he could do, as long as there was a legal dispute about whether or not he was still governor, he could do whatever he wanted on one side of the Rubicon. But as soon as he set foot with an army on the other side of the Rubicon, it meant that he was at war. So crossing the Rubicon is the moment of decision of whether you can do anything you want up until that point, but as soon as you cross that river, you're at war. and that's where he has his phrase alia jacta est, the die is cast.
Very good.
Are there any other questions from people? Yeah, sorry, go on. Sorry, there seems to be some connection difficulties. Would you be able to repeat that?
Sorry, I just said thank you very much for all the who did
I'm sorry, the connection seems to be breaking down a little bit. I'm sorry. But yeah, thanks to everyone for thanks to everyone for listening and for tuning in and for contributing as well.
Thank you so much, David.
Oh,
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Thank you, David, for me.
Yeah, thanks, David.
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll stop the sharing now. But yeah, just I will